This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody to our seminar tonight. Just to say that if any of you are not members and would like to join, we have membership forms here, and they'll do plan to stay for a drink afterwards. We're well supplied, so we welcome discussion over a glass of wine. We're very pleased tonight to have Brian Harrison to talk to us about an unusual topic in a sense for us, because you may have noticed in a lot of our seminar programs we become very focused either on particular times of research or particular topics. But tonight we have an unusual and welcome opportunity to think long and to think big about some of the most important issues regarding voluntarism and democracy. So I hand over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I did want to say that I want to end fairly early so that you can argue back at me and talk to me, because I've probably got quite a lot to learn from people here, particularly from practitioners in the area. I'm talking about voluntarism and democracy in Britain since the 1790s, and I'll start with a bit of definition, but I won't make too much fuss about it. Democracy is, I suppose, partly Christian in origin, with its humane values, its belief in self-realization and in the supremacy of conscience, but it also has a great deal, of course, to the Protestant variant of Christianity, in its distrust of authority, its distrust of superstition, its rationalism, its libertarianism, and its combination of individualism and participation, the belief in the active citizen. And it also owes a lot, of course, to a sort of secularized variant of Protestantism, namely the Enlightenment, with its high valuation of rationality and its faith in education. Democracy is, I suppose, a package of a number of components, which include things like some element of control by a very wide group of the population, combined with defence of the individual and defence of minority groups. It's not purely, in other words, majoritarian in its definition. It also includes a concern about minorities. If I turn to voluntarism, the Oxford English Dictionary has it as its first citation a definition as follows: the principle of relying on voluntary action rather than compulsion. And the first citation is 1924, but of course it would be nonsense to think that voluntarism began in 1924. It was there beforehand, but it had a number of other names, such as self-help, laissez-faire to some extent, self-improvement, charity, philanthropy, and it's really a term that is a portmanteau term for a number of terms that were often used much earlier than 1924, with the institutional subcategories of charity or foundation, pressure group, and with subcategories of pressure group, the interest group, and cause or opinion group. But I'm not going to say any more than that. We can go on forever, as some people do, about definitions. That's just a start. Both these two components, democracy and voluntarism, work in harmony to produce what I'd describe as a pluralist culture. And I'll outline 5 dimensions of it. First of all, they expand the number of participants in public life, voluntarists most notably. The sort of people they recruit into public life are maverick aristocrats like Lord Durham or Lord John Russell, to take very early on in the period in the 1830s, but very much in the 19th century middle classes. There's a sort of covert fight going on in the 19th century between aristocratic philanthropists and middle class philanthropists, with the middle class on the whole getting their way in many cases because they were good managers and they were prepared to put in the hours, which the aristocrats weren't, and they also had very useful professional and entrepreneurial skills. So that in the battle of the middle class for predominance, which was going on in the 19th century, philanthropy, I think, whatever the appearance is, played a very important part. Entrepreneurship, which, as you know, was characteristic of Victorian values, is very closely linked to philanthropy, to the invention of new ways of promoting social justice or humane values or whatever. The two are not distinct at all, whereas now to some extent I think they are distinct. And of course they recruit the working classes, trade unions, most notable example of a voluntarist organisation, and voluntarist in its values, not socialist, still not socialist in its values. Also any group wielding the power of numbers. That's the great strength of the working class as a potential recruit to the world of voluntarism. They've got numbers, and not only have they got numbers in 19th century society as such, lots of trade unions then, but they're also a promise of many more numbers. That is, they have great potential if the franchise is extended, with the hope that ultimately they'll predominate simply because there just are more, or were then likely to be more working class people than any other class. Of course, it hasn't happened like that, but that's how it must have seemed at the time. And of course, the working class voluntarists were very much linked with the emancipation of women, and also, of course, with the emancipation of subordinate groups within the United Kingdom, where in fact working class organisations were very strong, Wales and Scotland. And with the growth of provincial cities and their political influence. And the groups that are likely to be recruited to voluntarist activity and in their recruitment promote democratic participation are constantly being recruited. They're not a fixed number. They're always being added to. Newly discovered categories of the deprived are constantly being invented and still are. And for instance, with Josephine Butler, she uncovers prostitutes as a neglected group, for example, in the campaign for contagious diseases, against the Contagious Diseases Act, and in our own time, groups suffering from different types of sickness or disability have organised themselves into a new group of self-organised volunteers. So that's the first way in which the pluralist society is encouraged by the growth of voluntarist activity, but also I think it's not that they're recruited to public life, they organise on their own behalf or altruistically on behalf of others. They encourage groups to organise themselves and in that way to gain political experience and in that sense prepare the way for the spread of democracy. For John Stuart Mill in Representative Government, he wrote the antagonism of influences was the only real security for continued progress. And this is precisely what is stimulated by volunteers, the creation of a mutually educating society where people argue in public, in Parliament, and in small assemblies to some extent modelled on Parliament, training their members in self-help, self-mobilisation, self-organisation and political awareness. Pressure groups also have another function, of course rather a minority one, but they're safety valves for people who are frustrated in the existing society and for various temperamental reasons can't acknowledge the need for political skills, for moderation, compromise, even pragmatism. As Henry Vincent, the Chartist leader, said in 1850, public meetings are the safety valves of society. They let off the steam. anyone who looks at the internet at all, or at email communications between people now, will know that there are a great many angry people around. And one advantage of the pressure group from the point of view of democracy, it gives a lot of these people something to do, something to think about, something to exercise their energies, and thus rescuing us from many unpleasant things. Voluntarists are prone to claim to occupy a spontaneous non-party position or standpoint. They even claim to be apolitical. Trade unions, for example, and the Home Rulers, trade unions from the beginning, but Home Rulers in the 1870s and 80s, in the early 80s, were very much people who posed as being non-party. And there's a lot to be said for being non-party, because you can play hard to get in a competitive party system. You can get the parties to bid for your support, which to some extent the trade unions successfully did in the 1870s. You've also got some hope of attracting people from right across the political spectrum. That was the standpoint taken by the League of Nations Union between the wars, and of course by the Institute for Economic Affairs from the 1950s to 1979. Non-party groups are often in alliance with other supposedly non-party groups, and many of them go further and forsake the non-party alignment and actually join a political party, very often covertly or unobtrusively to start off with, but later on in full enthusiasm. A party alignment does bring some advantages. I pointed out that non-party alignment is a drawback in some ways, but and a party alignment has drawbacks, but it has the great advantage of offering the volunteer hope of government support, because at least the parties in the British political system on most occasions alternate in power, or at least offer some hope of alternating, and this gives the pressure groups that attach themselves to party hope as well. A third way in which the pluralist society is promoted by volunteers and voluntarists is through energizing competing political parties, therefore, encouraging them to compete and put before the electors rival policies, and promoting that talkative society that John Stuart Mill thought progress depended upon. The bipartite party structure in the British political system ensures that parties are quite distinct from pressure groups. In some countries, particularly in countries with proportional representation, it's very often difficult to distinguish between a political party and a pressure group. But in this country, it's very easy to distinguish between them, because if you've only got two parties, you've got to win support on a very wide basis, on a very wide spectrum of opinion, which is something that most voluntarists and pressure groups don't do. So in order to affiliate, or in some sense ally with a political party in the British system, the pressure group has got to adopt wider perspectives than it initially has. All three major parties, Liberals, Labour and Conservative, participate in this mobilisation through the party system of volunteers and campaigners, linking the campaign to government and the government to the campaign, public opinion to the politicians in Westminster. Most obviously, of course, the Liberal Whig Party specialises in recruiting and to some extent thereby neutralising many pressure groups in the community, most notably the nonconformists, of course, but also a number of reforming movements from Josephine Butler's movement to women's suffrage to the various movements for franchise extension. The polarity between nonconformity and the established church is integral to the growth of 19th century liberalism. The idea of an expanding frontier opening out from the towns, and particularly the provincial towns, into the countryside and finding new liberals or creating them out of the agricultural labourers and in the country populations. And particularly, of course, in Ireland, Scotland and Wales versus England, which on the whole then, as now, the Conservative Party had considerable strength in. But also linking Parliament not only to nationalities within the United Kingdom, but also to international causes via many of these movements. For Liberals, there's not only a two-party system and a dominant Parliament with cabinet dominating Parliament, but there's also the notion, as part of party policy, of pluralism in the form of civic culture, federalism and devolution. But although the Labour Party moves the left, the British left, away from constitutional reforms of this kind, it in fact assumes the role that the Labour Party had previously pursued before 1922 and accelerates some dimensions of it. For instance, the move from negative to positive liberty, which the Liberal Party was engaging in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but the Labour Party carries that a lot further. Though on the whole, with the trade unions kicking and screaming against that development. It also, apart from mobilising the trade unions and giving them a prominent role in the party system, it also is a key promoter of women's enfranchisement, not on the basis that a lot of feminists wanted it, but nonetheless they were keenly enthusiastic for the enfranchisement of women, and also moving on to the defence of refugees, internationalism, generally immigrant groups, and any beneficiaries of state welfare. So they open out from the way liberalism was going, and the quite unnecessary split between Liberals and Labour ensured that the Labour Party took over the liberal agenda and pushed it further. But I shouldn't leave out the Conservatives because they too have a role. First, of course, in catering for interests likely to be neglected by the Liberals or Labour, most notably rural interest, agricultural interests, or the established church. And the latest manifestation of that is the Countryside Alliance, of course, which didn't have a formal connection with the Conservative Party, but nonetheless, I'm prepared to, well, the bursar of my own college said he went on processions and it wasn't the sort of thing he normally did. They do sometimes use mass pressure group tactics, but they're aligned, these rural interests, broadly speaking, with the Conservative Party. When it comes to for reforms and voluntary movements identified with the left, Conservatives on the whole try to block what they're trying to do. They block the case for reform, and then when that doesn't work, they test the arguments and very often expose the highly specious arguments that are often used for left-wing voluntary movements. They sometimes actually win. The whole direction of policy is sometimes reversed, as it was in 1886, 1918, 1931 and 1979. More often, though, Conservatives concede the reform, having delayed it and in some sense rendered it safe so that it can be implemented in a diluted form with maximum acquiescence. In the two-party system, the two parties, Liberals and Conservatives, or Labour and Conservatives, continuously interact, pinching ideas from each other and personnel from each other. And I think Butterfield was entirely right to point out that British history does not consist solely of reforms conceded by Conservatives in the face of pressure from the left. It consists of a continuous interaction between the right and the left. And he emphasised, though he himself was, I suppose, a rather odd form of left-wing Cambridge academic, he emphasised the great importance of including the Conservatives in the story. There's a serious neglect, he said, in the case of the men who are most in need of it, namely the Conservatives, to include them in the national story. So, in the polarised competition for power, the two parties scour the horizon for good recruits, good tactics, good allies and good ideas among voluntary and self-organised groups. A fourth way in which the pluralist society is promoted through pressure group coordination through the parties is actually by building up the ideas, the agenda of government, and developing sensitivities and policies on such subjects as slavery, drunkenness, free trade, humanitarianism, religious freedom, women's dignity, peace, poverty, environmentalism and internationalism. All those causes, those ideas in that area are thrown into the public arena, and they have the more influence because pressure groups and volunteers are in continuous operation. They don't suddenly spring on the public at election time, they're there all the time. I suppose it's true to say that the reformers are often happier monitoring government, and they on the whole welcome being in opposition rather than in power. But the opposition party is anyway of great importance in the British political system, so they make their contribution in that sense. And of course in doing that they maximise the pluralism of public discussion. They mobilise such groups, if you take the left-wing anti-government elements, groups as the Child Poverty Action Group, Shelter, and Age Concern, as it used to be called. I think it's called something different now, isn't it? It's Age UK, yes. Anyway, they mobilise that type of group and ensure that their ideas at least receive attention in the public arena. Tony Benn in January 1971 even wanted to give groups of this kind what he called consultative status within the Labour Party, thus acknowledging how important they were. And of course I don't need to tell you that think tanks, which are another form of voluntary organisation, were essential to the growth of Thatcherism, the Thatcherite Revolution in the late 1970s. In that part of the 1970s, policy formation was first privatised as a preliminary to the privatisation of policy at the national level. And all this, a fifth component of pluralism that these groups encourage, is the validation of Parliament, parliamentary government, as a sort of emporium of conflicting interests, different interests and views, into an assembly where the reformer is sometimes thrust as a specialist and finds himself feeling rather uncomfortable as the assembly is, the Parliament as an assembly is an amateur assembly, not a professional assembly. You've only got to look at its library even now to see that. It's not a professional, the majority of the books there are not professional compendia, though they have those facilities, of course, most of them online nowadays. It's a gentleman's library. It's novels and entertainments, or whatever. So this dialogue in Parliament is highly educational, not least for the reformers and the volunteers who happen to find themselves in Parliament. They were very suspicious of Parliament, broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say, and they felt uncomfortable there. The audiences were not, they didn't applaud. I remember William Waldegrave telling me once that the most frightening thing about Parliament was not only opposition from the government, from the opposition benches, but from behind you. from backbenchers in your own party. In other words, if you're a reformer, you're not worshipped, you're not admired, you're criticised. You have to be tolerant of criticism all the time when speaking. So it's an educative assembly for everybody there, and of course, as Badgett would say, for the country at large. And its speaking situation, it's rather dramatic speaking situation, more in the 19th century than now, but it still is dramatic. If one listens to parliamentary questions, it seems to be awfully silly for people to say the questions are never answered, the questions are fudged, the answers are fudged and so on. That's not the point. It's partly that by being forced to prepare himself for answering parliamentary questions, the Prime Minister, or whichever minister it is forced to brief himself, and that in itself is a very good thing. But secondly, parliamentary questions are very much an occasion where the leader rallies his party in this two-party conflict. Parliamentary government is very much fostered by the sort of groups I've been talking about, and it works with them. They're mutually supportive because it's very important in getting any policy through that it has at least some fairly firm bedrock of support. And what the pressure groups can do is provide points of access to public opinion. In some cases, they actually do help to stave off trouble for a government through their contacts with a wider public. The most famous occasion on which that happened was in 1831, when there was a danger of the reform crisis actually going berserk. And the Whig government at that time worked through the Birmingham Political Union and the other political unions where it had contacts, and through working through them, it dampened down a potentially very dangerous situation with the full cooperation of the leaders of the pressure groups concerned at that time. Later on, of course, as you know, Gladstone, in effect, killed off Irish nationalism. That is, nationalism in its violent form that it was taking even in the London Underground in the mid-1880s, by putting up a sort of programme which the Irish Nationalist Party could go along with, the Home Rule Party, and in the end annexing it to the Liberal Party, so it became in a sense one of those groups that were captive to the Liberal Party right the way up to 1914. Now we know that didn't work in the end, but it worked for long enough. After all, Harold Wilson maxim was that a week is a long time in politics. A quarter of a century is an age. Or to take a rather trivial example by comparison, the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. It developed a policing system, and a system of inspectors in the 1850s, 1860s, which actually lent teeth to humanitarian legislation, and enabled or eased it through, and then ensured that it was enforced, very much assisting its friends in Parliament by doing that. Jonathan Porritt was very shrewdly invited by Margaret Thatcher on the 8th of December 1989 to consult about how she should handle her environmental protection bill. Again, Porritt, without, I think, in any way betraying his principles, was providing mutually convenient help to the politician in trying to get legislation through. Volunteers are especially valuable when the entire community needs to be mobilised in warfare. It's often said that the First World War and the Second World War lead to collectivism. They do, but they also lead to individualism, to the promotion of civil liberties and the development of voluntary action. With government encouragement in the First World War, the National Federation of Women's Institutes was put on a secure footing. The town's women's guilds, likewise, a little later, and in the Second World War, the Women's Voluntary Service, very much with government funding, and all these groups sort of skirmish on the frontiers of the welfare state in the 20th century and extend its frontiers further. In the 1930s, the National Council of Social Service, now I think the ancestor of the NCVO, is that right? Channel government money to the unemployed. Some pressure groups, I can think of two in the period between the wars, the Women's Employment Federation and the birth control movement, actually wanted from the start to get government to take them over. They were floating, they were starting something, but they wanted the government to take over. And it was a delicate situation because on the one hand they wanted to retain their independence and their influence, on the other hand they wanted to get in more fully into the public arena. And if you take the behaviour of the trade unions, what happened to the trade unions in the corporatist period between 1940 and 1979, it shows how dangerous it was. They nearly got eaten up. They nearly got corralled into becoming sort of agents or handmaidens of government. And in the end, of course, it all broke down, as you know. And in a sense, Margaret Thatcher rescued them from an impossible situation. Now, I'm going to change gear here because all the five arguments I've used already have a certain plausibility, as I gather from the fact that nobody's shouted me down so far. But of course there's an element of Whig liberal myth-making here, because all five arguments that I've used so far are in fact unconvincing, or at least they have very strong limitations to them. If one takes, I'll take these five arguments in turn. First of all, do the voluntarists really advance democracy through enlarging the numbers in the public arena? I've assumed that they do, and they do in some sense, but volunteers are peculiar people. They aren't necessarily representative of the population, and some groups are better organised than others. And one doesn't wish, if one's a genuine democrat, to ensure that the unorganised are neglected. As Norman Crowther Hunt said, I quote, "Laissez-faire pressure groups are as little likely to be conducive to the national interest as laissez-faire economics." You can't assume that the national interest is going to emerge from the clash between organised groups, if only because the organised groups are rather peculiar. In the 19th century, they were on the whole more likely to be middle class than working class. At first, they were more likely to be male than female, young versus old, and regional rather than London-based. And they were also more likely in the 20th century to be motorists, not pedestrians, producers, not consumers, organised groups rather than unorganised groups. You might say, well, some groups organise on behalf of others in an altruistic way, but that won't do, because slanted representation results from the activities of anyone defending a group when it doesn't suffer from its own suffering, so to speak. As an illustration of that, I suppose I'd cite Mike Thomas, an example in a book called Disability Politics, published in 1996, where he attacks the old, as he sees it, paternalist established charities, allegedly looking after the disabled. Quote, "They have influenced disabled people to reject their bodies and minds, to regard their impairments as a tragedy which must be eradicated at any price, and return to some mythical perception of undamaged normality. They have inflicted vast damage to disabled people's self-worth." Well, that's pretty strong stuff, but he has got a point, that it was very important, and has now been brought about, that the disabled have organised themselves. and they've organised their own pressure groups, and they run them, and they acquire in the process self-confidence and an enhanced political influence as a result. Besides, it seems to me worth asking whether one should give more political influence to people whose limbs are not so atrophied that it's possible that they can march to Aldermaston in support of their beliefs, or to people who sit in their drawing rooms and answer opinion polls. Hugh Gaitskell argued that it's the opinion polls that matter, not the people who are on the march. So there's a danger in indiscriminately extending participation in public life if you take the views of the organised as gospel. Do the voluntarists really advance democracy through nourishing groupings of self-educated people in democratic self-education? John Stuart Mill in Political Economy said, and I quote again, "The democratic constitution, not supported by democratic institutions in detail, but confined to the central government, not only is not political freedom, but often creates a spirit precisely the reverse, carrying down to the lowest grade in society the desire and ambition of political domination." Hence his advocation of local self-government and devolution and very radical reforms, actually, even by present-day standards. You can't assume, in other words, to follow up John Stuart Mill's point, you can't assume that volunteers, do-gooders, if you like to call them that, reformers, are enthusiastic in micro for democracy. They're not. One thinks of that admirable person, Dr. Bernardo. I am essentially what may be called a strong man, i.e. I rule. Well, there are plenty of others like that in the philanthropic world. Octavia Hill and Lady Reading, the leader of the Women's Voluntary Service, are examples I would quote, and many others one could quote. And the liberty that many 19th century liberals campaigned for was more political and national than social and individual. So there were many staunch liberals who were tyrants at home. 19th century trade unionists and nonconformists were not libertarian in their attitudes to women at all. And the reforming personality in general is not necessarily participatory, nor are reforming structures. There is a difference, it seems to me, between, of course, the situation of the person who backs authoritarian political parties and the person who voluntarily joins an authoritarian political structure, of which there are many in the voluntary world. And you could say, well, they can walk out, can't they? Which is what, in fact, of course, what Christabel Pankhurst said to people who disliked the policy of the WSPU, the militant suffragists. Of course, the victim of authoritarianism can walk out, in theory. I once had a contemporary in university who was a member of moral rearmament, and he chose to abandon the faith, and he went through hell because his former colleagues accused him of betraying them. And it's a sort of Scientology situation where it's not that easy to leave. The second point, a kindred point really, is a familiar point in Michel's political parties, the divergence within pressure groups, whether democratic in their structure or not, between the leaders and the led. It's not just a matter of ambitious individuals using pressure groups, scrambling into the leadership and getting high position, then betraying their members. It's a matter of leaders actually selling out, as the Labour Party would see it. The Labour Party has a great tradition of suspecting people of selling out and of losing sympathy even with their followers. It's a moral objection, not just a structural one. And thirdly, authoritarian structures are sometimes necessary for the volunteer, particularly if the volunteer believes he's right or she's right. You don't need to find out either about your cause or about how much support it enjoys if you just know you're right, as many people who I've been talking about do, otherwise they wouldn't have the courage to do it. Laboriously campaigning to drum up support for your ideals is, after all, rather a bore. It seems so slow. The more elevated the cause, the more need for haste there is. The more justified it seems to be to force the cause forward. And that's, of course, what the militant suffragettes did. I don't think there's any hope now of giving their due to the non-militant suffragettes who believed that it was extremely important to have a democratic structure in order that women, when they did get the vote, would know how to use it. They've been completely subordinated in the public mind by the militants, who, of course, were so brave. But it won't do as an account of what was going on at the time. Militant structures become authoritarian from necessity as much as from conviction. I don't think Mrs. Pankhurst was an authoritarian by instinct. She had to be authoritarian if she was going to outwit the police. But she didn't have to embark upon a course which involved offending the police. It led inevitably to a cell-like structure, rather like that of the IRA, and to a highly fragmented movement which caused enormous suffering to some of her following and in the end, in my view, was defeated. You can't escape from all these dangers by doing what a lot of people did in the 1960s and saying, well, we'll abandon structures then, we'll have direct democracy and we'll have no hierarchy at all. Joe Freeman's written what I think is a very shrewd article in the most obscure possible place, the Berkeley Journal of Sociology for 1973, no doubt drawing upon bitter feminist experience in the United States in the 1960s. It's called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, and I do recommend it to you. Her argument, broadly speaking, is that all groups seeking change need organisation, and the media, in fact, if they don't spontaneously organise, they demand organisation because they demand a spokesman to speak for the organisation. So if leaders aren't formally elected, they'll emerge spontaneously, and they, of course, won't be elected. Structure is inevitable, in other words, she argues. The choice is only between structures that are formal and structures that are informal. As she says, a structured group always has a formal structure, and many may also have an informal one. An unstructured group always has an informal or covert structure. So structurelessness becomes a way of masking power, as she puts it. The rules of how informal decisions are made are known only to a few, and power then becomes capricious and anything but democratic. Within a formal structure of decision-making, on the other hand, everyone can participate, at least to some extent. And my third point, were the voluntarists really so integral to the emergence of the two-party system? The tendency among reformers is very often, particularly those with religious connections, to fall into the category that Kornhauser described as radical institutions, to some extent suspicious of people in power, careless of whether they're supported by the public, and in the end, ultimately, as many suffragettes were, angry at the public who they were supposed to be trying to influence. A simplistic preoccupation with single reforms, dismissing politicians' resistance as merely malicious or corrupt, is no way of going about getting your way in a democratic political system, and an over-fastidious, protest-minded half-retreat from government is no route to progress. Many a voluntarist leader shows attitudes resembling Mosley's, of all people, writing in Tomorrow We Live, his manifesto of the 1930s, where he describes Parliament as a club-like institution with a bar, a smoking room and a lobby and dinner tables, as likely very quickly to rob a people's champion of his vitality and fighting power. That sort of attitude to Parliament is very common, maybe on the far right, if you regard the British Union of Fascists as on the far right, but certainly on the far left, and among the forming groups I've been discussing. One of the great virtues of Mrs. Fawcett's National Union of Women's Suffrage Society is that she never took a line of that kind. It would be very surprising if she had, because she was married to a prominent politician, Henry Fawcett. Some pressure groups, instead of working towards Parliament and guiding Parliament on opinion, move into the manipulation of opinion, the engineering of an appearance of public opinion, thus actually misleading politicians on what the state of public opinion is. Mass apathy doesn't mean that voluntary bodies are always in practice democratic in their structures. They try to open up the opportunity, in many cases, for a sort of Fabian-style utilitarian form of creating an opinion out of nothing. There's a new biography of R.H. Tawney by Lawrence Goldman, which will, I'm sure, I haven't had time to read it yet, but which I'm sure will show how bitterly he disliked this approach to the left. Tawney's view was that the public must be convinced first, and it's no good trying to pretend that a public opinion exists when it doesn't. And of course, as I've already pointed out more than once, this sort of attitude it didn't with the, well, I suppose in a sense it did with the Webbs, because they ultimately became apologists for Stalinist communism, but they didn't, in a period of influence in British politics, they didn't go for that. But of course the suffragettes did, making the attempt to coerce opinion which they couldn't persuade, thus giving the enemy everything they wanted. So if pressure groups and volunteers were helpful in building up the party system, and I don't deny they were very helpful, particularly in regard to the Liberal Party and the Labour Party, their influence was at best indirect, and all parties felt the need eventually to sideline them through creating their own independent party structures, not tied, as I pointed out, to pressure groups. So, of course, to some extent, the Conservative Party was energised in reaction against some of these pressure groups. The pressure groups can't possibly be described, except possibly in the case of the established church and rural interests, into creating the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party built itself up in a number of bursts of recruitment, and very successfully, in reaction against pressure groups. In, for instance, the Primrose League and the activities of that disreputable person, Lord Randolph Churchill, in the 1880s. In the 1920s, in the decade of Baldwin's mass conservatism machine, in the 1940s, in the Young Conservatives, and in the 1970s, the decade of Thatcherite resurgence. The Conservative Party certainly owed very little to the sort of groups that contributed so much to the British left, but the Liberal Party likewise took care to distance itself from the people whom I've been discussing. In the end, whatever Joseph Chamberlain hoped from the National Liberal Federation, a sort of aggregation of pressure groups, the National Federation was digested and absorbed into the Liberal Party machine and put under the control of the leadership in the late 1880s and 1890s. And liberalism ultimately outflanked Edwardian class-conscious Labour by, in effect, converting the Labour Party before 1914 into a sort of outcrop of the Liberal Party, or in the longer term, and it was a very long term, converting the Labour Party, the so-called Labour Party, into a Liberal Party. That is, classless in mood, gradualist in its welfarism, and promoting an opportunity society rather than an egalitarian society, which is what it now is. So I think the argument that I was making earlier about the contribution that these movements make to the growth of the party system is, at the very least, an exaggeration of their contribution. And the last point, the idea that they actually reinforce parliamentary government, needs a considerable pinch of salt. Not only do many of them refuse to provide any sort of recruit to the political elite. You'll remember the way in which Cobden Bright said when invited to join Liberal governments, "Oh, no, I couldn't do that." That sort of response is very characteristic of liberal protest movements. Again, the fear of corruption. But more importantly, when it actually comes to the point of framing legislation, when the politicians say, right, we're going to actually meet your needs, these reformers fade away. They don't actually know what to do. It's very odd, as some politicians thought at the time. When the temperance movement, which I wrote about when I was much younger, actually got to the point of persuading Harcourt to draft legislation in the 1880s that would curb the drink problem, they had nothing practical to offer, much to his fury. A better known example would be the Irish Home Rulers, who, when it actually comes to drafting a bill, have nothing to say. They're not governmental in their perspectives. That's not a great help to parliamentary government, I would have thought, and the point needs to be made. They'll, of course, defend themselves by using words like principle and no compromise and no sellout and so on, but they leave the government party, which is potentially sympathetic, in the lurch. It's true that in the period of corporatism from 1940 to 79, a considerable amount of help was given to the government in producing corporatist policies and in its extreme form, the extraordinary bold policy of planning national incomes from top to bottom. But they couldn't do it. They knew it was splitting their movement, and eventually they backed out, and who can blame them? The incomes policy, the corporatist acme, really, failed completely, and nobody now suggests it should be revived. So in my view, all five of my arguments I used to start off with don't really carry an awful lot of water. I'd like to finish by just drawing attention to three new challenges on which you're much better informed than I am. Is the situation now different? In three respects. First of all, the active political community, the active citizen, seems to a large extent to have bowed out, even to the extent of not joining political parties. In a sense, the success of the Liberals in co-opting so many groups into the political system has deprived the political system of its attractions, rather ironically. And so one looks at the, rather in a humbled way really, to the long queues of blacks in South Africa queuing up to vote when a very high proportion of British people don't bother. It's difficult to explain why this is happening. It's partly something to do with, as I say, liberal success. There are fewer grievances around, perhaps. It's partly due to secularization weakening the intensity with which political ideas are felt. religion as politics has now disappeared to a large extent, except in Northern Ireland, with the consequent decline of the active citizen. Recreation, mass recreation, provides much more exhilarating entertainment than anything even Lord Randolph Churchill could have offered. Secondly, there's the internet. Does that change anything? Very much. There are very high initial hopes on the internet of direct democracy, that it would, the belief that it would promote direct democracy, but of course the battle for control over the media, which never ceases, operates there just as much as it operates anywhere else. It's an arena for government versus anti-government fighting out their old battles on a new, more public stage. A very good book by an Australian called Pickerel called Cyber Protests, published in 2003, which I recommend. And she points out that the technical expertise that the internet requires means that this is male territory. That on the whole, in the environment movement, which is what her book is primarily about, privileges men to the extent that it relies upon internet technology. The men aren't elected, they just naturally gravitate to the situation, just as in an earlier generation they gravitated to being prominent singers in pop groups. It's a male world. It was argued and hoped that the internet would lead to decentralization of power, but that doesn't necessarily mean democracy. It perhaps gravitates towards no structure at all, which has the dangers I've already discussed. Anyway, it's not clear that the internet does change anything very much. It just carries to a higher plane what's always been happening, but I'll be interested in your views about that. It does, of course, make it easier for protest groups to link with one another, but they've always done that. Nothing new about that, it just makes it easier. What the politicians have so far failed to do, what their predecessors were wise enough to do, was to latch onto this latest means of communication quickly and to ensure that it doesn't outflank them. They will eventually latch onto it, and I think the whole structure of elections will be transformed by it, but it's taking a long time to happen. And the third area of uncertainty, really, is globalization. What room is there for democracy there? There's a very breathily idealistic article by a man called Lester Salomon in the periodical Foreign Affairs for 1994, in which he really expresses what now seem exaggerated hopes as a result of the internationalization that will result from the sort of voluntarist charity structures that grew up in the wake of communist collapse. He looked excitedly at the idea of a global third sector, a massive array of self-governing private organizations not dedicated to distributing profits to shareholders or directors, pursuing public purposes outside the formal apparatus of the state. Well, I think most people would say that if you use the United Nations as your vehicle, or even if you use the European Union as your vehicle for promoting these causes, or you rely on its aid for promoting them, you're risking something that's very far from being democratic, whether you like the European Union or not. You can only get things done in the European Union, or in the United Nations for that matter, through working through the nation state and through the elected leaders of the nation state. But the democracy is in that situation decidedly indirect and not direct. So I leave you with those thoughts about three areas of doubt about how, for instance, my successors might talk about this differently in 50 years' time, but you've heard quite enough from me, and I'll shut up.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's so many points to be delved into. Can I just ask? you know, you mentioned religion as a kind of an impetus to do things. I mean, do you think something has changed now, possibly because of globalization and better communications? Is it very easy to see that religion is now a very dangerous thing, that there's not much in it that looks like it's going to be helpful? I mean, do you think it's simply the exposure to what, you know, all kinds of religious conflicts everywhere in the world? There are, you know, sects of one religion against another, or faiths against each other. I mean, do you think that's...
Well, it's perhaps worth pointing out that Richard Dawkins pointed out that 9/11 would never have happened but for very strong religious belief. Religious belief so strong that people thought they'd go to heaven by doing what they did. But in general, of course, the developments you're describing are quite recent. That is, the potential of Muslim groups for terrorism was not something one suspected, or certainly hadn't impinged on British society in the 1990s. It's really only in the 20th century when that's happened. I think really probably what has been more important in promoting secularized values and suspicion of religious idealism is immigration, because there you have, as a result of immigration, so many groups, or so many people believing strongly in different beliefs. And the whole of British society is immersed in a situation that only missionaries faced in the 19th century, where a lot of people believe very strongly in different beliefs. So that compromise and the retreat from religious idealism is just compulsory, otherwise society would break up. So I think that there's something in that. But of course, where politics gained so much in the 19th century, and which is now lost, except on a very small group, is that the religious mentality encouraged the idea that there were right and wrong, there were blacks and whites. It was simple. You only had to make the right opting, and you do the right thing. I mean, that sort of attitude, that sort of black and white attitude, I mean, Margaret Thatcher, I haven't got the quotation at my fingertips, but she said, I'm in politics to promote good against evil. I suspect Tony Blair would say something similar. But I don't think any politician would sincerely believe that that was at all feasible in modern society. Society is much too complicated for any sort of attitude like that. It caused enough trouble in Gladstone's Liberal Party, let alone now. I don't know whether those points sort of contribute to answering your question.
I mean, I would say I think religious impulse is still really important in America behind charitable action.
Yes.
You still see great American benefactors setting up charities like Cure to do operations on children's pallets in Africa, and that, you know.
Yes.
So it's part of their social obligation as being Christian.
Yes, it's perhaps worth saying that religion is much more alive in America, at least religious organisation is much more alive than it is here. And the black and white attitude surely did pervade the government in relation to Iraq after 2001. I mean, with disastrous results, in my view. You can't run around like a bull in a china shop in the modern world like that. This isn't an American tendency, it's a tendency that we had in the 19th century, and a degree of arrogance that one would now feel ashamed of. So you're quite right in saying that a lot of these groups, actually a lot of these groups are Anglo-American anyway. I mean, the groups I've been describing, the anti-slavery movement is an Anglo-American movement, so is the women's suffrage movement. So to some extent is the movement for public welfare in its voluntarist component. There's a lot of interaction. So I agree with what you said, but do you want to make any other point?
No. That's it.
I just wonder if the separation between political parties and the voluntary sector is quite as clear as you make it out to be. I'm thinking roughly from the 1880s to, say, 1930, that the political system is very hybrid. And I think that the creation in the 1880s of the women's sections gave you a sort of hybrid organisation. That politics is becoming perhaps more and more professionalised. But alongside you have the Primrose League or the Women's Liberal Federation. Later on you have the women's section of the Labour Party. Mostly these are people who are never going to be professional politicians, initially because they can't and later because it's not what they want to do. A lot of women after World War I go into local government, which is actually a more philanthropic impulse than a sort of political ambition impulse.
Extension of social reform.
Yes, and then you have things like Labour's relationship with the cooperative movement and the Women's Cooperative Guild, and it just makes me think that for a while at least, this is a more hybrid picture. I don't know if other countries have the same.
So your disagreement with me is on what precisely?
Well, organised pressure groups, one-issue pressure groups, may not have such an influence on political parties and the development of their policies. But a party's leaders might have to say, how is this going to play with the Primrose League? How is this going to play with the Women's Liberal Federation? Will they continue to canvass for us? This sort of thing.
Yes, I've got your hands up as answering.
Yes.
I thought I recognised. Yes. Of course women were very active in the political parties in different types of organisation from those that I've been discussing. That is, they didn't need to be recruited. They were already enthusiastic members, and the Women's Liberal Federation was very influential in the Liberal Party in the Edwardian period. And Lady Carlisle got awfully cross with the suffragists for making things difficult for her. So I'm not saying that all women by any manner of means were going along with the franchise movements or even with the anti-franchise movement, because the antis, of course, had a lot of women supporters too. All I'm saying is that insofar as women's suffrage was a prominent issue in the Edwardian period, it had a very complex relationship with party structures that had in some sense to deliver legislation. And as far as the Liberal Party was concerned, the only sort of women's suffrage it could deliver was adult suffrage. And as far as Mrs. Pankhurst, and for that matter Millicent Garrett Fawcett, were concerned, they were up a gum tree on that. Because it required them, in a sense, not to be feminists at all, but to be campaigners for franchise extension on a democratic basis. And you had to choose one or the other. And of course, a number of very shrewd women did choose adult suffrage in preference to equal suffrage, that is, giving the vote on the same basis as to women as to men. So that I think the failure of an important section of advocates of women's emancipation to gear themselves in with the party structure, whether militants or non-militants, caused an awful lot of trouble and made it very difficult for the vote to be conceded. Well, in fact, the First World War, as you know, made it all much easier. But of course, you're right in saying that women were very active, particularly after 1918, in the WCG or in Towns Women's Guilds or Women's International Federation. I mean, there are just all sorts of movements they go into afterwards. But this was very much Mrs. Fawcett's point, that you must train them in campaigning for the vote to actually be able to use it later.
A lot of them were in party aligned. A lot of women were in party aligned organisations.
Yes,
so
they were.
There must have been some element
Oh, they were. Oh, of course you're right in saying that. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Just
Another former pupil of mine.
one aspect that we haven't actually touched on, but is quite interesting, I think, is those people who start a career in public life in voluntary organisations and then move on, sometimes into party politics, which you mentioned. I'll come back to that, but also quite influential positions in the civil service sometimes. And they are actually making quite a big difference to policy formation and so forth, and bringing particular kinds of gifts. I'm thinking of people like Louise Casey, for example, who's been the czar for various things with quite a high public profile, who developed her skills and knowledge in Shelter and other organisations like that, or Helen Edwards, who became a very big boss in running criminal justice system, having started her career in NACRA and so on. So
Yes.
if we're looking at the possible interactions, might not completely forget people who are doing it in that way rather than going actually into party politics.
Yes.
The other thing I'm going to mention.
If I could just intervene there,
Sorry,
I mean, you would point to the London Society of Women's Suffrage, wouldn't you, who cultivated and trained women to be civil servants.
Yes.
And there are some
amongst other things.
prominent examples of that. I can't remember their names now, but you'll probably remember them. So, agreed, carry on.
Well, so the other point that I want to mention is how tricky it is, I think, for many voluntary organisations, particularly perhaps charities today, as to how to handle the fact that many individuals who go into political life and public life and prominent positions in voluntary organisations are actually the same people, because it has the same excitement and it requires a lot of the same qualities and ambitions and so forth in those people. And so there is quite a big class of very able people that move from charity to be special advisor to a minister, to be an MP, then when the time going gets a bit rough, back to charities again. And meanwhile, the charities have got by law actually to be non-party political, and there are some real dilemmas if in many ways the best candidates, who appear to be your new chief executive, was an advisor to Tony Blair, or and there's some really quite difficult issues, and it's part of the reason why the current government has become very edgy about the campaigning role of voluntary organisations. Because looking through party political spectacles, they can see Gordon Brown's people running these charities. So there's a very interesting dynamic that comes from something you touched on, which is it's the contradiction between wanting to be non-partisan and non-party political, but the fact that many of the best people come forward are political to their fingertips.
Yes. There is, of course, a professionalisation that goes on in the world of pressure groups, which led Eleanor Ruthven, I think it was Eleanor Ruthven, I always mixed her up with Mary Stock, they're both such admirable people. I mixed them up, but one or other of them pointed to the fact that in the interwar period there was a professionalisation of the charitable world, which actually removed the distinction, which I discuss here in the 19th century, between the amateur campaigner and the professional civil servant, and the two, as you say, rightly say, merge. So are you arguing that what we've got now is a sort of elite, which includes politicians, civil servants, and pressure groups and charities, which actually excludes the rest, or is insensitive to the needs of the rest, or how would you argue on that?
I think there is such an elite, and I think that point is right, that it's a rather professionalised culture where people can be quite interchangeable. This is at a national level in particular. And I think it poses, I'm really only arguing that I think it poses particular interesting questions about how you handle this, for example, the need to be non-party political, and how you try and sustain those important kinds of principles when in fact the cast of characters is becoming rather homogenised and professional.
Yes.
Frank.
How does the fact, or what appears to be the case, that about 45% of charitable funding now comes from government sources?
Yes.
This considerably muddies the water between government and charity.
Yeah. Yes, and that and the money's on the whole normally accepted with alacrity, but I think they know the dangers, and the dangers.
Well, the more they take, the more they proclaim their independence.
Yes.
Like we had Teresa.
Yeah. Yes. Quite. Yes. I mean, I suppose the way out of this was Cameron's Great Society, isn't it? I mean, if you can only devolve government to these groups, that problem to some extent goes away. But of course, the whole thing has collapsed anyway, so it's not getting anywhere. Yeah, but you're quite right to say that that's happening. It certainly is happening.
Well, they're taking over the charitable sector by stealth. This has been quite clear for the past 20, 30 years.
Yes.
What happened in the 1980s, in my view, this is a personal view, is that when the Labour Party was out of power for such a long time, a lot of clever, ambitious people on the left decided the best way forward was to move into the charitable sector. And particularly on the welfare side, they campaigned to get more money from government. Gordon Brown delivered the goods later on.
Yes.
And the result is we have a rather emasculated charitable sector.
Yes.
And what's happened is these people get money which feeds their campaigns, leaving the independent voluntary bodies, the charities which don't get government funding, to have to compete with organizations who get funded for their campaigns by government.
Yes, that's
It's very
interesting.
unfair to them.
There is a movement the other way. I mean, this is a form of privatisation, isn't it? I mean, that is getting the voluntary bodies to do your welfare work for you, and then winding down the Department of Health or the HSS.
Well, it would be terrified if
So,
they took away their charitable
if I may
status.
just make the point, it's actually coming from two directions. I'm sure you're right in saying that the Labour Party is looking for opportunities, but Thatcher is keen to get rid of these tiresome welfare responsibilities and get somebody else to run them.
Well, she contributed to the muddying of the two sectors because it was the National Health Service Act of 1980 which gave charitable status to hospital appeals, national hospital trusts.
Yes.
And any number of institutions then looked for charitable status, which are eventually agencies of government. And nobody knows what a charity is any longer.
Yes.
So why give? It's a problem with the universities. It's been there for a long time.
Well, quite. I mean, in our own university, Thatcher really created fundraising. We just didn't. If you look at the list of donors to Oxford University on the steps of the Bodleian Library, they were quite full up to about 1930, and then people hardly gave anything at all. And now they've all just about filled another whole marble board thing, admittedly with quite a lot of Americans. But I mean, this is all since the 1980s. It's an extraordinary change.
George.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to return to the point that was just made a moment ago about this kind of elite of people who move between the third sector or voluntary sector and politics and then back again. I don't think that's anything particularly new to our time. If you think about the university settlement movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, that was very common, that idea that they were actually supposed to be institutions for kind of schooling up and educating the next generation of public servants and political leaders, and that there was then a lot of interchange between that kind of the charitable world, which was rapidly professionalising and changing, bringing more women in, but also the civil service, political party eventually, think of Clement Lee and Beveridge, but then academia as well, of course, Beveridge going into LSE, and those kind of interchanges have always been there. So yeah, I mean.
But there is a slight proviso I'd make to that, and to what you were saying, Anne, was that local government is sort of more acceptable as a place where women can operate because it's really domestic. I mean, the men run the big things. They run foreign policy and business and economics and the empire. Women, well, we can give them local government. I mean, it's sort of a bit like housekeeping. And so actually forming the Women's Local Government Association or Women's Citizens Association and so on is a bit of an acquiescence in separation of spheres, I think. I think that the really pace setters in women's political advance don't happen at the local level. They happen, I'm afraid, they're among the Barbara Castles and the Margaret Thatchers. You see, I mean, one needs to remember that local government was the one concession that Mary Ward, the leader of the anti-suffragists, made. She didn't object to votes for women in local government. What she objected to was women advancing into the male sphere of national government.
Mrs. Humphrey Ward.
Yeah.
Mrs. Humphrey Ward,
She
yes.
was involved in local government. She was helping. She was
Quite.
providing
Quite.
services for children with special needs.
Quite. Children in
you can
Hampshire.
always turn it around and say a lot of the functions of local government were originally carried out or co-carried out by women anyway, like educating poor children. I mean, it's the other way around, that often these services were running and then eventually they became funded by the state.
Yes.
So I wanted to say something a bit different. I hope I haven't missed it, but what I was thinking was that, I mean, the aim of a lot of voluntary organisations are not just these organisations that exist kind of freestanding for all time. I mean, a lot of them aim to make themselves redundant by getting the law changed.
Yes.
So engaging in the political process is actually their raison d'etre.
Yes.
Like the Anti-Slavery Society, Women's Suffrage, I mean, even if they exist afterwards. So I felt there was this sense of this sort of idea that they almost should be or might be completely separate from government doesn't really work for a lot of
Yes, there are two.
organisations.
Yes, that's interesting. There are two things to say to that. First of all, I did mention two movements, and there are several others, which actually aim to be made redundant: the birth control movement and sorry, temperance. Well, yes, I suppose so. Temperance, yes. But no, the other example I have, what it was now, Women's Employment Federation. She Ray Strachey wanted WEF to be taken over by the government, and it was in the business of registering women for employment, making sure women's got careers, and she certainly wanted the government to take it over. So there's no doubt about that. So you're quite right in saying that was one strand. But I've now, alas, forgotten what the other strand of what I was going to say was.
Well, no, it just seems to be, it's part, well, I've just said this really, the function of a lot of voluntary organisations is actually to change the law.
Yes.
All kinds of things. I mean, that maybe they want to change the law once. Like if you're
Have you reminded me of what I wanted to say?
Oh,
yes.
Right.
Yes. These movements don't actually die. That's the trouble. I mean, if you're saying that they aim for legislation, then that's it.
Well,
it's not it. They move on, and they get one reform and they want another. And this is one of the conservative arguments against them. Of course, if you give in to one, Lord Salisbury was brilliant about this. If you give in to one, you'll have another one on your doorstep. So you might as well hold out on, I don't know, Unitarian burials or something, because otherwise they'll be wanting something else. You've got to sort of draw the line early.
Slavery was slightly. I mean, I know the society continued to exist, but obviously abolishing slavery was a kind of big moment, wasn't it?
Mm.
And also when you're looking at the relative importance of different voluntary societies at any one time. Obviously, some of the ones that were important 100 years ago have become less important because they've achieved their goals through engagement in the political process.
But my point is they never or very rarely fold up. And the Women's Freedom League folded up in 1962, really quite at the wrong time because the movement was just taking off then again. But that's very rare. They don't often do that. They find some reason for surviving, some some reason for carrying on, or they add a new twist to their causes. They don't lie down and die at all easily.
Some do, like lead in petrol.
I'm sorry?
That campaign for lead in petrol, for example, that was an example of a specific...
Has that not finished? What is it now?
Yes, well, it's finished. It's mission accomplished.
Oh, it did actually wind up. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that's quite unusual.
Metropolitan Cattle Trough Association.
That's two.
Sorry, can we have one more here?
I think there aren't many examples of organisations. So often when you look at things through mergers, you suddenly find that many of the old organisations have merged together. So particularly if you look at organisations like Action for Children or something, they actually have a much more overt religious establishment, and through mergers, now, so when you look at the history of the organisation, that you see that actually an organisation that you think doesn't exist has just actually merged. But the point I really wanted to make was carrying on the point you made about the links between politics and voluntary organisation people, and the fact that I wondered whether you thought the decline of mass political party membership had changed the relationship between politicians and voluntary organisations. So that one of the things that seems to me in my own work very obvious today is, say, through the work of all parliamentary groups, which are often their work is often sort of sustained by an appropriate voluntary organisation like the Alzheimer's Society for the APPG on dementia, and how sometimes politicians, because they don't have such a good sort of local publicity machine, they often have to do things like, tweet, went to marvellous meeting of so-and-so today, they're doing such great work. So that sort of, I wonder if perhaps it's almost like a return to the earlier days you were describing of
Yes.
the sort of, people like Wilberforce and Shaftesbury, where the links are actually much closer now, and it was a
Well,
sort
yes,
of
yes. I was touching on this at the end. I mean, the 3 points. The first of my 3 points where things are rather fluid at the moment. It seems to me to be political apathy. I mean, in many ways, we're not apathetic as a society, and the groups springing up all the time and doing all sorts of things, new things. But they're not geared into the party system in quite the way they were in Gladstone's day. They're not overtly politicised in many cases. So there's something. Well, if you're an enthusiast for democratic values, there's something wrong with the system that doesn't really produce the vibrancy of political interest that existed in the 19th century. And various attempts have been made. I mean, I think the Blair government's made a valiant attempt to introduce various reforms like extending postal voting and mayors in local government and things like that, to try and sort of gear in with this sort of spontaneous voluntarism that somehow does exist in English society, but doesn't gear itself towards Westminster in the way it once did. But it didn't really get anywhere. I maybe the future lies in, and some politicians are gearing into this quite a lot, sort of Twitter and I don't even know the names of them. I certainly never look at them, but I mean, they'll have to if they're going to keep any hold on opinion. Facebook and so on.
The back.
I just wanted also to think about how occasions occur where political parties need to sucker favour with voluntary organisations. And you mentioned groups like the Women's Institutes and the Times Women's Girls and the other groups I do my research on. And there's lots of examples during the 40s and 50s where these groups were very much being courted by government for the respectability that those groups had. So groups also like the Mothers' Union. So there was a clear examples where on issues that were of interest to them, for example housing or payment of family allowances, where the political parties were seeking the endorsement of these groups and asking them to come and give witness to various royal commissions and the Beveridge, for example. And they really wanted, to have that kind of recognition that the government, that these are non-political organisations in the true sense of the word, that they wanted an endorsement.
Yes.
It shifts the balance between the relationship between the two. These groups always thought it was very non-political and sometimes irrelevant. Actually, when you look at their history, were extremely influential, and they did change policy on housing.
Yes, depends on the pressure group, doesn't it? I mean, if it has a degree of expertise which the government doesn't have and wants, then of course they'll listen. The RSPCA had that. One needs to remember that at least until really quite recent times, government was very weak. That is, it had a very little expertise immediately at its disposal, and it didn't have a proper police force either. So it was heavily dependent on voluntary groups for any influence it had, really. So that it certainly did co-opt or try to mobilise or interact with a very wide range of people in British society, and of course what destroyed that in some sense was the growth of the welfare state and public welfare generally, and the development of expertise within government. So you didn't need these groups anymore. I think that was part of the problem. But of course, the way out from that, I suppose, is actually to go back to what Margaret Thatcher called Victorian values and devolve and disperse government power and thus leave them as the experts to look after various areas of public policy. But that has all sorts of other problems which I won't bore you by going into now. But of course it is the case that the expertise of pressure groups was very much, and still is, cultivated. The most striking area that I would point to is housing associations, which had almost died, really, certainly were not in public consciousness until Margaret Thatcher's massive campaign for privatising council houses. And then she had to find some sort of role, and did find a role, for semi-moribund associations, namely the housing associations, to take over the council housing that she wanted to get rid of. So the housing association movement, I probably don't need to tell you, it's really quite an important movement now. It wasn't really very important in 1970, but it was important in the 19th century.
Can I just ask one final question, which is about what appears to be a sort of two-speed or two-track system of left and right as they relate to government? Because I'm just wondering, it seems now with this new Lobbying Act that there's somehow the idea that it's entirely illegitimate for organizations, charitable organizations, campaigning organizations, actually to campaign as part of the political process, but it's entirely okay for capitalist organizations to do so. I mean, has this always been the case, or at what point does it somehow, clearly charities might have been a nuisance campaigning, but when did they become illegitimate? I mean, is that new, or has that always been around?
Well, the idea of charities being non-political is, I'm no expert, some other people here are more expert than I was, a very long-standing one. There's nothing new about that. What is new is that very large areas of British life have been privatised. So that there is now, as in the Victorian period, vast areas of British life which aren't now subject to or dependent upon the expertise in Whitehall. The departments are being closed down or shrunk. The Next Steps agencies created sort of semi-autonomous bits of government that eventually were privatised in the late 1980s and after. And in many ways, the Victorian situation is coming back in that respect. But this would keep us going for hours.
Well, thank you very much. I think let's have a round of applause for our speakers.